If you don't know what RondoDox is, this can be an opportunity to start your own research on it and follow up on it. But before we go deep into how it works and how it operates, I'll start by giving you some context. And the first thing is like, so who the hell is this guy, right? So my name is João Godinho. I work at BitSight, part of the thought leadership team. So you might be asking, what the hell is thought leadership? So this is a team that we have where we try to show to the community the kind of technical work that we do at BitSight. And this is one example. You've seen like also in the morning the work from my colleagues as well. They were part specifically from the threat research team. So my background is in computer science. I have a master's in cybersecurity and intelligent systems, which the cool kids say it's AI. I do a lot of threat research stuff. That's my favorite thing. Although I don't mind doing other things like, vulnerability kind of things, doing a lot of Intel stuff. And also, I'm a big aviation geek. I have an airline transport pilot license. So if you want to talk about airplanes, I'm also for it. So to provide some context on this research, I would like to first setting the stage for it. So we know there's a lot of internet exposed devices out there. If you follow reports from, for example, the IoT analytics, they produce multiple yearly reports. And they expect that by the end of 2026, we'll have around 24 billion IoT connections. When we're looking at our own data, we see also a billion observations of data points per month, and this means exposed devices in the internet, and that includes vulnerable devices, not only open devices to the internet. So everything has a system on a chip right now. We saw yesterday on the DOS market talk where the guy was bragging about having 2,000 fridges infected, so it's exposed to the internet. Why? I don't know. And also, I don't know what's happening. Okay. And also on top of this, many of these devices have very questionable supply chains. So if you order something from AliExpress or Alibaba, even maybe from Amazon, they can just be a dropship supplier from those questionable supply chains that sometimes you don't even know what arrives at your place, what kind of firmware, what kind of apps are out there installed. So it's free field, good luck, have fun, and and that's how we achieve these kinds of Izuru, Badbox, Rapperbot, Kimwolf, all of these IoT botnets. So one of those is RondoDox. So RondoDox was first disclosed by Fortinet in July 2025. It caught our attention a little after around August because of the volume of traffic they were generating in our honeypots. We saw they were having exploitation attempts since at least May 2025. And they had a very active development both on the malware side of things and on the exploit side of things. And they basically tried to focus on DDoS and mining capabilities. So basically, the way we're going to structure this, I'll give you a quick timeline of the research itself to contextualize when we started and when we cut it off for this presentation. We'll go more in depth into the infection chain. I want to specifically look at the initial exploitation, the scanning and exploitation, the initial implant, the binary itself, and then I'll focus also on the network protocol, which is very simple, also a very good indicator of their network activity. And then we'll pivot to the threat evolution and the operational details. So we'll see some changes that we've noticed throughout these months, as well as some infrastructure details of what they're using and what they potentially can be using. And then we'll just close it off with some questions and if it's still relevant today, for example. So in terms of timeline, May 2025, when it was first, when we first saw exploits for it, so we don't know if it was active before. July 2025, Fortinet first publishes about it because they were seeing a lot of activity on it. And then around August, that's when we also saw an increase in activity on our honeypots, and then we started doing this research. Around January 2026 was when we cut off the data for this presentation. It coincided also when they actually slowed down their activities. Also recently, around late February, they started having more activity, which I'll try to show some of it as well here. So going into the infection chain itself, we'll split this into these major 4 blocks. Pretty straightforward stuff. So they do have the discovery phase, followed up by the exploitation, where they're dropping the initial implant script, which then fetches the main binary. And then after doing all the stuff in the main binary, like the persistence and dropping the minor, removing other malware, they start communicating with the C2, and they will just keep communicating with the C2. So discovery and exploitation. So the way they do it is they have infrastructure that it's constantly scanning the internet and doing scene scans. So on the top right, you can see examples of this. And you can actually see there it's the same scan that is being done to the same target IP of our honeypots at 2 different times, at 325 and at 508. And then what happens, or what I believe happens, is they then forward this to the exploitation phase, where they then act on that open port. What's interesting here is that we can see that they're doing like sequential scans. So we have some IPs on our honeypots that are sequential in IPs, in numbers. So we can actually see the time it takes between them doing multiple scans of the same port for different IPs. And then what they do is when they found an open port, they do just a shotgun approach. So basically, if they have like 100 vulnerabilities for port 80 and you have port 80 open, you will get 100 exploits on your endpoint. It doesn't matter if it works or not. They'll just throw whatever they have at you. This specific example here is for a Linksys vulnerability. So you can see it's a command injection on this parameter, and they just fetch a script and pipe it to the shell. So this is how they were operating until recently. And then we noticed some breaking news now in February 2026 when they slightly changed the dropper endpoint. And what they did was they started adding this 4-byte X string, which was basically just your public IP XORed with this static string. So I don't know if they're probably likely doing this for some kind of filtering of who's getting the script, but this was added fairly recently. So going now to the initial implant itself, it's pretty much split into 4 basic sections, where we have the basic anti-analysis, we have the removal of other malware, we have some exploration phase where they try to find a writable directory to drop the binary, and then we have the phase where they're actually fetching the binary for the specific architecture and running it. So going into a little more detail on each phase, the first thing that they do is they just, some basic anti-analysis. They try to redirect, or they do redirect std out and error to dev null, and then they do the basic check to see if the script is being run from terminal. Pretty straightforward stuff. Then they just go into the removal of other malware, and then do like 2 main things here. So you can see that on line 1 there, they iterate all the processes that are running, and then the first check they do is if the symlink is valid. So what this means is if the symlink that's running on /proc/process_id/executable, if that symlink is invalid, it most likely, or I think it likely means, certainly means that the binary does not exist on the file system, so it's being run from memory. So if you run like PS, you will see like it says like deleted on the process name. And my assumption is that they say, okay, if the binary is not on disk, we assume it's a malware binary, so we're just going to kill it. The other thing they do is that they look for specific binary directories. So you can see there in line 6 where they're iterating directory, the temp, var, dev, mount, run, and home. And if the binary is being run, the symlink points to a binary that is one of those directories, they will also kill it. One exception here is that you can see on line 4. Yeah, so they check if on line 5 that it's highlighted, you can see that they check if it's being run on a /lib directory inside a directory with a lib name, and if it is, they skip it, and we'll see why in the next slide. One minor thing that they also do, they just disable the mandatory access control. I guess they probably saw some issues with trying to run the binary, so they added this, but I think at some point they removed it actually. So next, we go into the third phase, which is the exploration and trying to find a writable directory. So like I said before, because they use a shotgun approach and they throw everything they have multiple directories where they try to check if it's writable. And I believe this is because they support multiple vulnerable systems. So for each time they would add a new vulnerability, they would then add the directory that they knew works on that specific vulnerable system. And for example, one very clear thing, for example, the usage of remounting the root as read-write is a good indicator for IoT things that sometimes they mount root as read-only. And so like the first thing they do is they try to mount it as read-write so they can then actually write into it. And so the way they find the writable directory is just they try to run all of those commands, they write the .t file, they change the permission, then they remove the .t file. And so the last line that works on this list will be the directory that you'll be in. And here you can actually see why they don't remove the /lib directory, because they themselves, they use it to drop their own binary file. So moving forward to fetching the binary itself and running it. So they pretty much do this for all the architectures that they support, which at some point were 18. So pretty much between line 2 and 10, sorry, you would see this copy pasted for all the supported architectures. So they just fetch the binary, try to run it. They check the exit code 137, although they've removed this recently. And one interesting thing here is when they run the binary, you can see that how it's highlighted, that they pass the argument, which is the name they have for the vulnerability. In this case, it's linkcsre, and then a dot and the architecture that they're targeting. In the end, they remove and then clear history and exit this, the shell. Okay, so we've seen like the scanning and the initial exploitation phase. We'll now look into more detail on the actual binary. I'll try not to go very deep into it. I'll focus on the things that I think are more interesting and can lead you to find similar binaries with the same indicators. But if there's something that you want to know more about, feel free to just send me a message or just grab me outside and I can just open GuideRay and I can show you something very specific that you want to see or something like that I'm not specifically mentioning. So the main binary has a couple of key features. First of all, like I previously mentioned, it targets 18 different architectures, or it did target at some point. It's basically statically linked, stripped, so just to make it a little harder to analyze. In terms of functionalities, it removes other threats like the script was doing, sets up persistence, has some detection, tries to avoid some detection and analysis. It drops the crypto miner, and this is a fairly recent feature that they added around November 2025. And then in the end, they just enter the communication loop where they basically start communicating with the C2. Okay. Okay, sorry, I'm not seeing that screen. Okay, I'll go from here. So the infection chain itself, I'll start with the start of the binary. I just want to point out some specific things. So they start by validating the argument that they receive, which, as we saw, was the vulnerability name and the architecture. And then they pretty much they call online 80 what I define as the watchdog function, and I also want to highlight it like the string decryption. I'll focus a little bit on these two things because they give you good indicators of how this works, and they're interesting, especially the nanomite stuff. So the nanomite, this is basically a feature that tries to prevent people from running a debugger on the process. So generically, how it works is you have two processes, the child and a parent, and you can use the child to monitor if the parent is being debugged and have the parent attached to the child so no one can debug the child. So you can see like in line from line 19 to 22 where the child is actually monitoring the parent process, and basically if the parent process is being debugged or something is attached to it, it will kill the parent process. And then the parent process on the lines below, it basically calls ptrace with the ptrace C, so it doesn't stop the child process, so you cannot attach to the child process. So you might say, okay, but what if I kill the child process? Then it won't be monitoring the parent one. But if you see in the top here on line 14 to 17, they're actually setting like a signal action for the sick child. So what they're doing here is if there's any change to the state of the child, and a change can be the process is killed, the parent would then kill itself. So the parent is also looking at the child and see, okay, if someone kills it, I'll just kill myself, and then execution just stops. Regarding the string usage, what's interesting is that, like other malware, they decrypt the strings, they use them, and then they null the strings in memory. So basically here they're decrypting a couple of strings, they're using it on line 98. So this function demonize and sigignore basically just redirects, creates a new process, redirects the std in, out, and error to null, and sets a bunch of calls to ignore multiple signals to the process. Nothing very interesting itself. You can also see below that in line 111, they also check if a kernel debugger is present. So the string decryption, this has seen some changes since we first saw the first sample. Initially, they were just using like an inline XOR for it, pretty straightforward. After they removed the inline XOR and they started using a function with the same XOR, just a 1-byte XOR. And most recently, what they did is they have them custom obfuscation, which is not very complicated. They do a bunch of transformation, as you can see here. There are some samples where they changed the order slightly, as well as the XOR key that they use inside the string decryption, but nothing major. So following this, we have the removal of other malware. So basically, this encompasses multiple steps. As we've seen before, they do similar things as they've been doing before on the initial implant stuff. They kill processes that are running from /temp, /vartemp, and /dev. And one other interesting thing that they do is that they look at cron entries, and they will move entries that start with those strings that you see. So they're likely looking for other malware that infected are just running Python or Bash or whatever, and they try to remove it. They also look at binaries that are being called from the cron tab, and they will remove the binaries if they're statically linked. So here they're assuming that if a binary is statically linked, then it's a malware, then I'm going to remove it so it doesn't compete with me. So moving to the avoidance detection also with the removal of other malware here. This is a more proactive capability that they have. So before they were just looking into like the cron and just removing stuff that's statically there. At this point, they actually have a more proactive behavior where, first of all, they rename binaries that an analyst would use. So, for example, IP tables, UFW, shutdown, reboot, halt, power off. They rename those binaries to random strings. Those random strings are actually hard-coded in the binary, but they're encrypted, but they're a good indicator, though. You can search for them in an infected system. And then they basically have a fork in the function where they do two things. So they monitor the usage of tools, and I think you can see it, on the right side. You can see a lot of tool names like pstop, hstop, ps3, blah, blah, blah. So they're monitoring if a process is initiated with that binary, and then they will kill it. And at the same time, they would also do that for example, xmrig or miner. So they also try to do this for other potential competing malware in the same system. So now that it has set up or tried to remove all of their stuff and try to avoid being detected, they move on to the persistent phase. They start by moving the binary that's being executed into systemd with a random name, and this is 7 to 9 random characters. And they call they set a new calling thread through that to that new random name, and they fork and exit the parent process. So basically, the initial infection now disappears, and now they're running from systemd with a random name and a new thread. They then look at they copy the self-proc executable, so the executable from memory into etc rondo. So this is a very obvious indicator that you're compromised. It's just, okay, if you have a rondo file folder in your system, you're compromised. And then, again, they try to set up a service in multiple files, like initd, inittab, and RCS, to set up a service that will restart their malware on a reboot. On top of that, they will also try and add a reboot line in the cron that will call the binary. And I think that the reason that they're doing all of these things is, again, because they're targeting multiple systems. So instead of checking which system I'm targeting, they just throw whatever they know that works and see if they're successful. So one thing to note here is you can see it's highlighted that before the argument that was being called to the binary was just the vulnerability, the dot, the architecture, but now they include the dot persisted string. So initially, your binary will be run without the persisted, and after a reboot, it will have the persisted string on it. So after setting up the persistent, they now go into the dropping of the binary itself. So this was added around November 2025. And they start by doing, they try to set the CPU scaling to performance to improve the miner performance. I only observed miners for 64, 86, and ARM architectures. This binary is fetched from one of their hosting C2s. And what's interesting is they validate that the response header server contains the string rondo. Right now, the way they set up the miner is they using XMR-rig proxy on one of the C2s. So they control, you cannot see like the mining capabilities that they have because they're connecting directly. One interesting thing is that they're using the vulnerability name as the username for that miner. So on their side, they can actually see what vulnerabilities are more profitable in terms of mining capabilities, because they will have all the usernames based on the vulnerability. Initially, when they deployed this around November, they actually used a hard-coded wallet. And I think right now that wallet maybe still has like 4 miners, but it has like around maybe less than $200, so not much on that initial phase. Okay, so we've seen these 3 phases, initial phases. I want now to go into more detail on the actual comms and see the commands and how it works. So it starts by randomly picking a C2, and there are 2 C2s that are hard-coded into the sample. They use port 8443 to connect. They send a check-in message initially, and then they wait for commands. So the check-in message, you can see it's a very straightforward string. It's rondo. Here you can see when they're using the actual argument. And then it has a 1. So the 1 is just a counter that gets incremented every time that they start they open a new socket to the C2. This message is only sent once when you connect to the C2. On the right side, you can see the actual diagram of the logic. So it starts sending the check-in message, and then it sets a read timeout for 10 minutes. If there's no message within 10 minutes, we go into the left side. And what the binary does, it will send a check message to the C2, and it expects the C2 to respond with an ACK. And this is just a plain string with a new line at the end. If the C2 doesn't respond with an ACK, so it basically terminates that connection, and it will rotate to the other C2 and start over again. If it responds with an ACK, then we go back to the top of the diagram. If they receive some data within those 10-minute timeouts, they first check if the data is actually a health check from the C2. So if they receive a check, they have to answer with an ACK, pretty straightforward, and they go back to the top. If it's not a health check message, they first start and look if the message starts with a dot. This is their way of checking if the message is encrypted. And the encryption they use is just a 1-byte XOR, so pretty basic. If it's encrypted, they just XOR it with the bytes. If it's not encrypted, they just parse the command. So we observed 16 different commands support that they have. where 3 of them were for bot management, and the other 13 were for DOS capabilities. One interesting thing is no command requires a reply. So the bot will only parse the commands, and then they will continue on with the loop. So you can see on the right, this is pretty much the function that's handling the parsing of the commands. You can see all the different branches, so it's a very good visual indicator of how it's set up. Regarding the management commands, pretty straightforward. They have the .exit. This kills malware and all the malware processes, so all the processes that are in the group of the parent process. But this does not remove persistence. So if you reboot the system and they were able to set up persistence, then you will still be infected. Then you have the .sys command. Also very straightforward. The .sys receives an argument we call CMD, and what they do is just pass that CMD string into system. They have one interesting feature here is that if the CMD string contains a placeholder called arg1, they will replace that placeholder with the argument that the binary is run with. So for example, if they receive echo arg1 into temp test, that becomes linkczre.x8664 persisted into /test. And then they have the kill, which is also pretty straightforward. It receives a signal and a process name, and they will basically just call kill with that provided signal to that specific process name. On the side of the DOS commands, so 12 of them are actually to run some kind of attack, and the other one, which is .stop, is just used to stop an ongoing attack. So the .stop receives one argument. If it's an actual IP not 0000, it will stop the attack to that IP. If it's 000, it will stop all the ongoing attacks. For the DOS attacks, they have an internal structure that keeps track of the target IPs, the threads that are running those attacks, and some of the attack details, so they can actually use the stop command to stop the attacks. The type of commands that they support run at different levels, so at the internet transport and application layer, and we'll look a little more into this. The commands themselves all receive arguments. They're very similar. The commands are on the top right here, always starting with a dot. They're all very similar. For example, we can start with the .type argument. Sorry, the type argument. This can be one of 28 different types of packets, which you can see on the bottom right side. Then you have the IP, the duration, straightforward, port, packet size. The packet size is only relevant if the type is raw. Then we have, so it's only relevant the type is raw because the other packets already have a defined size. The bind port is an interesting parameter that allows them to set up a listening port on that specified port. Then we have the number of threads that should run the attack, and the sleep time, which is just how much it should sleep between, each thread should sleep between sending packets. The type of packets that they support, when they have like a template for some of the packets, and they're dynamically generated data for them. So if, for example, the CS2 packet has a placeholder for some data that can vary, they will, during runtime, generate that data and send it. So the packet will not be the same one always. And as an example, you can see, for example, kind of redundant what I just said. If you want to run an attack on 192 blah 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 on port 123 for 10 minutes, using 5 threads to send UDP packets with CS code data, this would be the command you would send to the bots. So I would like to highlight some specific commands here, which are quite interesting. These are the ones on the right side. These commands, they try to use raw sockets. So first of all, to use raw sockets, the binary needs to run as sudo, or they need to have the net raw capability. If they don't, they will fall back to using just normal sockets. But the interesting thing here is that these commands receive an argument that we call the change source that can take 3 values. So no, basically nothing happens. Then we have the rand. When it's set to rand, what they do is they change the source of the packet, the source IP of the packet, to a random IP. But it will not be a random invalid IP or a random IP from a LAN network like a bogon IP. It will actually be a public IP. And then they have the OVH, which is quite interesting. They have 39 hard-coded OVH CIDRs that are publicly known. And when you set it to OVH, they basically pick a random IP from that list, and they will use that IP as the source IP address. So they will build the entire IP packet, and this is actually sent. So they build the IP header, and then they build the UDP header and send it. One other command to close the command parts that I wanted to talk about is the spoof command. This is the only command where you can specify a source IP address. So aside from those that use raw sockets, the spoof one, you can actually specify what IP you want to use on the source IP address. What's interesting besides that is that for some reason, this is a UDP packet. And what they do is they fetch your public IP address and they place it inside the data of the packet and send it. So if you might receive a UDP packet that has it could be a forged IP address, but then inside the packet you'll see the actual public IP address of the victim. Okay, so we've closed pretty much the infection chain part of things. Now I'll go more into the threat evolution and operational details that we observed during this period. So they were fairly active between May 25 and January 2026 with some changes or a lot of changes in infrastructure, vulnerabilities on the implants and the binaries themselves. During that time, we observed 174 different vulnerabilities. They were using 32 hosting and exploiting IPs. And they only used 4 C2 IPs. On the files side of things, we saw around 160 different implants and hundreds of unique binaries, which is expected because they were supporting 18 architectures. We reduced that down to make it more manageable to just around 100 for a single architecture. So when we look at the vulnerabilities, of those vulnerabilities, 148 have a published CVE. 15 of them have a public POC but have no CVE, and 11 of them do not have neither CVE nor a public POC that I could find. So I don't know if there could be a 0-day or not, but I did not find what they were targeting with those exploits. You can see pretty much the timeline of how we observe things on the right side. So you can see how at some moments, they would just throw a lot of vulnerabilities. I'm guessing they were probably testing, and at some point we saw 49 exploits being used in a single day. The average number of days each exploit was used was 18, but when you look at the number of vulnerabilities that were just used for one day, it's almost half. So there's a large standard deviation here. So some of the vulnerabilities were used a lot, and some of them were not used at all. And I guess that they were likely just testing the vulnerabilities, and they would likely remove it and if they saw no results from it. One other interesting thing about the vulnerability things is that they were pretty active in terms of finding relevant vulnerabilities. So for example, the React to Shell vulnerability, they added it to the exploits 3 days after the disclosure. And one other good example is this 62593 CV, which is a array vulnerability that they added it before the CV was published. So it kind of shows that they're likely looking at research reports or vulnerability reports about things and maybe adapting to it. If we look at the actual IPs, so the exploitation and hosting IPs, we can see that they segregate their infrastructure by functionality. So on the right side graph, you can see a timeline where basically the blue lines are the hosting infrastructure and the orange lines are the exploitation infrastructure. You can see that the hosting infrastructure, there's no overlap in IPs. So there's only one active hosting IP during this entire time, but during some periods they were using multiple exploiting IPs. The exploitation infrastructure is, the standard shady VPS that accepts cryptocurrency as payment. The hosting infrastructure, however, is far more interesting because they were mostly residential IPs. And we were like, kind of sus. So we looked at our historical scanning data for some of those IPs, and what we found was that some of them were hosting things that you shouldn't be exposing on the internet. Like, for example, we saw one that had Unify Protect, which is a CCTV solution from Ubiquiti. One that had Control 4, which is like a smart home system thing, and one had like a TCL Android TV exposed in the internet. So we think these might be compromised IPs without being completely sure, but it's a high possibility because they were using residential IPs and they would switch. So the fact that they also have exposed things with potential vulnerabilities is not very, it's kind of suspicious. On the IPs, infrastructure IPs for the C2s, we only saw 4 of them, and these were all VPS providers. They were almost always using a single IP, but at around December, January, they switched to using 2 IPs, which is why they basically are randomly choosing one. We don't know if it's because the botnet was increasing in size, that they want to have some more redundancy and more support for the higher number of bots, but this is what we observed. Now, if we look at the infrastructure from like a different perspective, so the hosting IPs, we noticed that they had some kind of blacklisting logic. I'm not sure if it was IP-based or connection logic-based, but if you were blacklisted, you would receive an HTML page with a video of a rap song. And like the HTML would say, you will not find it here. It also had like the email of the Rondo stuff and so on. And the C2 side of things was also interesting because at some point they had a C2 certificate that was actually signed by Let's Encrypt for the vanilla net DDNS.net subdomain. This was between like June and November that subdomain was pointing to the active C2. The XMRig proxy C2 also returns a self-signed certificate, but we didn't find anything interesting there. We likely believe that they might have like the admin infrastructure, the admin interface. Maybe they were using it behind that subdomain, but we didn't find anything, so we're not sure about that. So moving more into the changes that we saw on the initial implants. So there were a lot of implants, so it's not easy to see the difference on all of them. So what we did is we tried to cluster them using normalized compression distance. So this is basically a very good metric that it's application agnostic. You can use it on binaries or whatever, but it works real well with text files. And how it works is it uses the difference in compression size to give you a similarity between 2 files. So if 2 files are similar and they get concatenated together and you compress them, that compression will be higher than if the files are very different and you compress the concatenation of those 2 files. So we use that to plot this similarity matrix that you see. So the way this works is the diagonal means it's the same file. So this picture is mirrored on the diagonal. So lighter means it's a similar file, so all the diagonals are the same file, so 100% similar. The darker means less similar files. The white lines you see are basically the clusters where we define if the samples have over 90% similarity between them, then we assume it's a cluster of the same sample, so to reduce what we have to look at. And if we go from left to right, we sorted this by timeline. So the left samples are older, and the right samples are newer. And what we can see from here is that as you go, if you start on the top left and you go right, the samples that are closer together are more similar, and if you go full to the right, they're less similar. So and you can see in the diagonal, they have some similarity, they keep some similarity between themselves, which shows some kind of incremental changes between the files. So this is a very interesting metric to see like if the changes were incremental or not, which they were. There are some exceptions that you can see, for example, these like vertical and horizontal, which is basically the same sample here and here. we believe were more or less when they were deploying like a testing script for the miner, where they were just dropping the miner and running it. That's why they're very different from everything else. They had nothing related. And the incremental changes that we saw were basically the addition and removal of supported architecture, because they were testing the vulnerabilities for different systems. And some checks for the writable directories, also related to vulnerabilities. They were updating the email they had at the top, and they were adding and tweaking the evasion and the competition removal things. So the RondoDox binary itself, what we saw, like over 100 different x86 binaries, and to cluster them, we used mcrit. So mcrit is from Daniel Pullman. He actually presented it at BotConf a couple of years back. And it's a very nice tool because it uses min hash to compare the similarity between basic code blocks in binaries. So we fetched all the similarity between all samples, and again, we did the same graph here. The biggest difference from the previous graph is that this is not a timeline. So left to right is not a timeline, because we weren't sure when the sample was being deployed. So what we did instead was look at an inter-cluster similarity. So we look at clusters that were similar between themselves, and we put them together. So this shows like 3 big clusters, A, B, and C, which shows like these clusters, there are multiple clusters because they're delimited by the white lines, but these are very similar between themselves. And here, like the major changes we saw were like the number of commands. Initially, it was 9, then 23 DOS protocols, which increased to those 16 and 28. The encryption changes, which causes a lot of changes in the basic logs. They had some mining logging where they created like a /temp/contact me or contact.txt, where they just placed an email and nothing else, and then the addition of the mining capability. So, onto some more Illuminati kind of things, based on the breadcrumbs that we saw about like the emails and the rap videos and so on. So they make this threat clearly identifiable based on the indicators like the rondo, the video clips, the emails that they have. The emails also always mention like 2012, 2013. And the music that they show on the blacklisting page is from 2012 as well. It's from a rapper called Little Mister that died in 2019. And also I found out like from the Chicago area as well, there's a rapper named Rombo Number 9, which is currently in jail. And I believe they were kind of part of the same rapping group or something. So it's a very interesting coincidence. So, So I'm pretty much closing here. As we saw, this was a very active threat during 2025. They had a lot of changes, a lot of vulnerabilities. This shotgun approach it's kind of a lazy way to do it, because you're just pointing like, throw everything you have at an open port and see what happens. Currently, the activity seems to have slowed down, although like I mentioned initially in like February, it seems to have picked up a little pace. They added 1 or 2 new vulnerabilities. Many of the protocols for the DOS are game related, so it might suggest that they're into like the DOSing or DDoSing gaming servers. But if we look at the addition of the mining capabilities, we might question if they were being successful or not with the DDoS service. So maybe they were trying to monetize the infected victims in some other way. One interesting thing is like they were using very old exploits. I think one of them was from 2014, but it had no CV. What we saw was that there were a couple of these examples where during 2025, they actually had a CV, and they were added to Kev by CISA. So, and because the Kev is actually a known exploit, so this could be related to the RondoDox because it was causing a lot of noise. Which it's quite nice that they were able to add old CVs, old vulnerabilities to have a CV. We did attempt at communicating with the C2, and we know they were working because we would send a check message, they would respond. Sometimes we would receive the check message and we would respond, but we didn't get any actual commands for any DDoS. We also weren't successful at gathering any telemetry because we were trying to use NetFlow, and because the port was 8443, it kind of blends in a lot, so we don't want to assert anything on the size of the botnet based on that, because it's very debatable. And I'll leave with if this threat is as relevant as it was before. When I was doing the presentation, I was like, oh, maybe this will slow down, maybe it's not as relevant. But because they started to pick up some activity now, maybe it will still be relevant in 2026. So this is all I have for you. Thank you very much. I have 2 links here. The one on the right, I think it's already published, but it has more details on what I've been saying. Thank you all.
Thank you.